This here is case file number 061, filed in the summer of 1987. The account comes from a man named Daniel Ashford, who was found wandering the ridge roads near Crow's End, Kentucky, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1974. He was carrying nothing but a hand-drawn map and a single photograph of a limestone formation. He didn't speak for 3 weeks after they brought him down from the mountain. When he finally did speak, he asked the doctors one question, over and over, in that same low whisper. Can you hear it breathing? This is his account. This is what he found beneath the earth. And this is what the earth found in him. It is October 1978. 4 years later. Daniel Ashford sits in the dark of his basement. Not the finished kind with drop ceilings and paneled walls, but the old kind, where the concrete foundation weeps mineral water year-round, and the air tastes like rust and memory. He has not left this room in 11 days. The single window, set high in the concrete, has been covered with a blanket and plastic sheeting. On the floor around his chair, there are pencils, all sharpened down to nubs, and a journal filled with his handwriting. The same sentence repeated thousands of times. It is only the wind. It is only water through stone. It is only the wind. His hands rest on his thighs. His breathing is shallow. Even now, his breathing moves with the rhythm he heard there, in the dark below, where the mountain spoke in the language of pressure and release, of air finding its way through cracks in the world. A sound comes from somewhere. Not from outside, from deeper, from under. It is faint. It is the sound you hear when you cup your hand over your ear and listen to the blood moving through your own flesh. A low, rhythmic, organic susurration. Daniel's eyes, which have been closed, do not open. His jaw tightens. His fingernails dig small crescents into his palms. The sound continues for 7 seconds. Then it stops. In the silence that follows, Daniel begins to rock, very slowly, back and forth. His lips move. He is reciting something in a voice so quiet that you would have to be pressed against his face to hear it. Not breathing. Not breathing. Not breathing. But it is breathing. And he knows. Now, to understand what happened to Daniel Ashford, you have to understand the land itself. You have to understand what grows beneath the mountains of eastern Kentucky. In those places where the bedrock is soft, where the water is patient, where time moves in geological stanzas instead of years. Crow's End is not on most maps. It is a settlement perhaps we should call it that, a gathering of homesteads built on the border of what the old geological surveys called limestone karst terrain. This is country where the rock below is not solid, not the way most people think of rock. Limestone is a rock made of the shells and skeletons of things that died in ancient seas millions of years ago, when this land was underwater. It is soft, it crumbles, and most importantly, it dissolves. Water, given enough time, will eat through anything. Water is the most patient thing alive, except perhaps for the earth itself, and the earth is mostly water anyway. So you could say the earth is eating itself, generation after generation, cave by cave, in the dark places where no sun has ever reached. The karst country around Crow's End is riddled with these caves. Some are large, chambers big enough that a man could walk through them for an hour and never reach the end. Some are tiny, barely wider than a man's body. Crevices where water has worked for 10,000 years to create a passage. But they are all connected in ways that no living person fully understood. They form a network beneath the hills, a circulatory system of stone and water. And when you stand in one cave and make a sound, that sound travels through channels and voids, through spaces that have never known air that wasn't filtered through millions of tons of rock. The Ashford family had owned their land for 90 years. 3 generations of Ashfords had lived above that network without ever knowing what was beneath them. They had a well, like most farms of that era. It was a good well, clear, cold water year-round, the kind of water that made you feel like you were drinking from the bones of the world. But in the spring of 1974, that well went dry. Not slowly, not the way wells sometimes do, with the water table dropping season by season. This well simply stopped. One morning, the water was there. The next morning, there was only the sound of air sighing up from the depths, a low moaning that made the children nervous and made Mrs. Ashford, Daniel's mother, bring crosses made of twigs into the kitchen to hang above the sink. The well diggers came. There were 3 of them. Old men who had dug wells in those hills since before the Depression. They brought their equipment, their dowsing rods, their intuition honed by decades of listening to the earth. They went down into the well shaft, and they came up shaking their heads. "Stone," one of them said. "It's like the bottom just closed up, sealed itself." But it hadn't. What they found when they looked closer was that the water was still there. The water had simply found another path. The limestone had shifted, or perhaps it had never shifted at all, and the water had simply been diverted through some deeper channel, drawn to some other destination in the dark. Daniel was 23 years old that spring. He had recently returned to the farm after 2 years of half-hearted studying at a state school in Lexington. He had no particular gift for farming, but he had a gift for problem-solving, a quiet, methodical way of approaching puzzles that his father said would be useful if he ever learned how to apply it to anything practical. "There's a well out there," his father said, looking at the dry shaft. "It's mapped on the deed. It's labeled on that survey from 1901. But I've never heard of a well in the back pasture, not once in my life. And my father never mentioned it either." This is what his father said, and this is what sparked something in Daniel. Not greed, not hunger for discovery, but curiosity. The kind of curiosity that is dangerous precisely because it is patient. "I'll find it," he said. Daniel began that summer. He had a metal detector, an older model, nothing fancy, but it had been reliable for finding nails and fence posts buried in the pasture. He started with the maps. The deed from 1901 was not precise. It showed the well as being somewhere in the back acreage toward the limestone outcrops, perhaps 400 paces due north of the standing barn. He walked those paces. He used the metal detector. He found nothing. He drew maps in his notebook. He marked them with pencil, noting where the ground was softer, where there were depressions, where the grass did not grow quite the same way as elsewhere. The back pasture of the Ashford farm was perhaps 50 acres. It rolled down toward a creek, Crow Creek, which gave the settlement its name. And in the distance you could see the ridge where the true limestone country began, where the earth showed its bones, where you could walk for a half hour and see no soil at all, only exposed stone, gray-white in the sun. By the end of June, Daniel had not found the well, but he had found something else. There was a sinkhole, not a large one, perhaps 10 feet across and maybe 6 feet deep at its deepest point. It was partially grown over with vines, honeysuckle mostly, the kind that smells sweet and sickly in the summer heat. The bottom of the sinkhole was damp. There was water there, you see. Not a lot, but a trickle that ran toward the back of the hole, toward a crevice in the limestone that was barely wide enough for a man's hand. Daniel stood at the edge of this sinkhole for a long time. He did not climb down immediately. He stood and he listened. There was a sound coming from that crevice, a very faint sound, the kind of sound you might dismiss as wind at first, but which, if you listened long enough, began to seem rhythmic. In, out, in, out. The sound of air moving through a passage deep in the earth. He climbed down. The limestone beneath the vines was warm in the afternoon heat, warmed from above. But as he descended, he could feel the temperature dropping. The earth does not warm easily at depth. It holds the cold of winter all through the summer, and by autumn it has remembered that temperature so completely that it is hard to believe that the sun exists at all. At the bottom of the sinkhole, the crevice was indeed no wider than his hand. He knelt, and he put his face close to it, and he breathed in. The smell was like nothing he had ever encountered. It was not the smell of fresh earth or growth or decay. It was a smell of depth itself, a smell that came from the compressed darkness of millions of years. It was mineral, yes, but with something organic underneath. Something that suggested that somewhere in this darkness there were things that lived, things that had learned to exist in a place where light had never penetrated since the limestone was formed. He reached into the crevice. His arm fit up to the elbow. His fingers found smoothness, not rough stone, but smooth, polished almost by the persistent pressure of water over centuries. He pulled his arm back out, and he sat there, in that cool, dark sinkhole. And he understood something then that he would spend the next 3 months trying to dismiss or rationalize. The well was not lost. The well had never existed. What existed was this: the karst, the caves, the living network of stone beneath his feet, beneath his house, beneath the entire settlement of Crow's End. And it was calling. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel returned to the sinkhole daily. He brought tools. He brought a pick and a shovel. He carefully expanded the crevice, chipping away at the limestone with a patience that would have impressed his father, widening the opening by fractions of an inch until, by mid-July, there was a gap that a man could squeeze through. He also brought a flashlight. It was a heavy 6-volt model with a metal body and a handle that had been worn smooth by his grandfather's hand. He tested the batteries. They were good. He wrapped them in plastic to keep the dampness away. On July 16, 1974, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun was high enough that the heat shimmered off the pasture, and his mother would be occupied with canning tomatoes in the kitchen, Daniel Ashford put on clothes he did not mind getting dirty, packed a rope around his middle, placed his grandfather's flashlight under his arm, and lowered himself into the crevice. The passage beyond was tight. His shoulders scraped both sides. For a moment, a long moment, long enough that he felt the first true touch of panic, he thought he might be stuck. But the passage was sloping downward, and the angle helped, and with a final push, he found himself in a space large enough to move in. He turned on the flashlight. The cave opened up, not suddenly, but gradually, as his eyes adjusted to the beam and he could see the contours of stone around him. The floor was limestone, smooth and faintly glistening with mineral deposits. The walls rose up, and the flashlight beam could not reach the ceiling, which meant the ceiling was higher than the beam could travel, which meant this was a chamber of some size. He was breathing hard from the effort of the descent. He forced himself to slow his breathing. He forced himself to be calm. He had read about caves. He knew that certain things, his own exhaled air, his body heat, the disturbance he caused by moving, all of these things changed the delicate equilibrium of a cave system. He stood up slowly. The passage he had come through was now behind and above him, a narrow crack in the stone. In front of him, the cave floor stretched out, and as his eyes continued to adjust, he could see that the floor was not completely smooth. There were formations there, shapes that suggested the slow accumulation of minerals over geological time. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and though he could not see them clearly, he could see their suggestions, darker lines hanging down into the darkness above. But it was not the formations that caught his attention. It was the sound of water, somewhere deep within the cave system. Not dripping, that soft, metronomic patter of water falling drop by drop. This was something else. This was the sound of water moving, flowing through channels, through voids, moving with purpose. And it was rhythmic. It had a pattern, an almost biological pattern, like breathing, like the breath of something very large and very old, moving in and out of its lung-like chambers. Daniel moved forward slowly. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of him, lighting stone and shadow in equal measure. The cave floor was uneven, and he moved carefully, not wanting to turn an ankle, not wanting to fall into a crevasse. As he moved deeper, the smell of the earth grew stronger. It filled his nostrils, his throat, his lungs. It was a smell that made him think of deep time, of the weight of millions of years compressed into the rock around him. After perhaps 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. This chamber was tall enough that the flashlight beam faded into darkness before reaching the ceiling. The walls curved upward in sweeping arcs that suggested both the hand of water over geological time and something else, something almost intentional, almost architectural, as if someone had been here before him and had marked these walls with purpose. He moved to the nearest wall and held the flashlight close to it. The stone was carved. There were lines in the limestone, deep grooves that could not have been made by water. These were marks made by something with intention, with purpose. They did not form letters that he could recognize, and they did not form pictures in the way that petroglyphs or cave paintings did. Instead, they formed patterns, spirals mostly, spiral upon spiral, carved into the stone with what must have been patient, repetitive effort. Some of the spirals were shallow, barely visible. Others were cut deep, so deep that his fingers would fit into them when he touched them. He traced one spiral with his fingers, following it from its center outward. And as he did, he noticed something. The deeper parts of the spiral were warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding stone, and the warmth seemed to pulse the way a heartbeat pulses, in, out, in, out. He pulled his hand away. He did not know how long he stood there. Time felt uncertain in this place. It could have been minutes or hours. The cave did not have the normal markers of time. There was no sun, no shadows moving across walls, no rhythm except the breathing of the stone and the distant sound of water moving through unseen passages. Eventually he moved on. He had to. Some part of him, the rational part, the part that still believed in cause and effect in the material world above, told him that he needed to understand what this place was. He needed to find the source of the water sound. He needed to know what he was dealing with. The chamber opened into a passage, and the passage sloped downward. The stone beneath his feet became smoother as he descended, polished smooth by the flow of water, and the sound of water grew louder, no longer distant, no longer rhythmic in that measured breathing way, but loud, immediate, a roar that grew as he descended and turned a corner and suddenly found himself in a vast space. This chamber was enormous. The flashlight beam could not reach its far side. It could not reach the ceiling, which was somewhere in the darkness above, somewhere beyond the capacity of a 6-volt flashlight to illuminate. And the sound was everywhere, coming from all directions, echoing off stone in ways that made it impossible to determine where it originated. There was a river, a real river flowing through the cave, perhaps 30 feet below the ledge on which he was standing. He could not see it directly, but he could hear it, could sense its presence by the pattern of echoes, by the way the sound of it bounced off the distant walls. It was moving fast, the sound of white water, of rapids, of a river that was in a hurry to go somewhere, to find another outlet, another path to the world above. Daniel stood on the ledge and tried to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing, what his own senses were telling him about the magnitude of this place. This was not a small cave. This was not a cavern that you could walk across in 5 minutes. This was a space that dwarfed anything human-made, that suggested ages of time during which water had worked patiently to hollow out rooms from solid stone. He moved along the ledge, flashlight held before him. The stone was slick beneath his feet, damp with moisture that hung in the air like an invisible presence. The air itself had changed. It was heavier, thicker, charged with a quality that made his lungs work harder to extract oxygen from it. Each breath felt like an effort. It was during this movement along the ledge that he noticed the shapes in the stone. They were not carved this time. They were formations, natural formations, in the way that stalactites and stalagmites form. But they were wrong. They were too regular. They were arranged in ways that suggested intention. They rose up from the floor of the chamber like figures, like monuments, like statues of things that had no clear shape, that were not quite animal and not quite human, but something in between, caught between states of being. One formation in particular caught his eye. It was near the edge of the ledge, where the cave floor dropped away toward the river below. It was tall, perhaps 8 feet, and it had been shaped, or had grown into a shape, that suggested a face. Not a clear face, not the way a sculptor would create a face, but more the way a pattern can emerge if you stare at clouds long enough. The way your brain will impose meaning on chaos if given enough time and darkness. The face was looking down at the river. Daniel stood very still for a long moment, understanding, on some level that he could not articulate, that he was seeing something that he was not meant to see, something that predated his understanding of the world, something that belonged to this place in a way that he, with his flashlight and his rational mind, did not. He forced himself to move on. The ledge continued for perhaps another 50 feet, and then it opened into another passage, sloping upward this time, moving away from the sound of the river, moving toward, he could feel it, the same way he could feel the warmth in the carved spirals, moving toward something else, another chamber, another space in this vast network of voids and formations that lay beneath Crow's End. It was when he emerged into this chamber that Daniel understood, finally, what he had found. The chamber was smaller than the previous one, but more intricate. The walls were covered, entirely covered with the spiral carvings. They covered every surface, layered upon one another, overlapping in ways that created a visual rhythm that was almost hypnotic. And they were everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling, a palimpsest of spiral upon spiral, carved by patient hands, or by patient what had been hands, over what must have been centuries. In the center of the chamber, there was a stone formation that took Daniel's breath away. It was a well. Not a modern well, not the kind with a rope and a bucket, but a well nonetheless. It was a perfectly circular opening in the stone, about 3 feet in diameter, carved with such precision that Daniel knew with absolute certainty that no tool made in the modern world had created this opening. The edges were smooth, worn by something that was not water and not stone, but something between. And from that well there came the breathing, in, out, in, out. It was unmistakable now that he stood directly above it. The air moved up and down in a rhythm that was too perfect to be accidental, too alive to be anything other than what it seemed to be. The earth was breathing, and this well, this perfectly circular opening in the stone, was the mouth through which it did so. Daniel knelt at the edge of the well and shone his flashlight down into it. The light faded into darkness almost immediately. There was no bottom, or if there was one, it was too deep for the flashlight beam to reach. But in the space between darkness and light, he could see something. A thin mist moving upward, rising out of the well like breath, like the breath of a sleeping thing, coming and going with that patient geological rhythm. He reached toward the mist. His hand passed through it, and the mist was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. A cold that seemed to carry information, seemed to carry the temperature of places deeper than any place that had ever known warmth. And as his hand moved through the mist, he heard something. It was a voice. Not a voice exactly, but something that his brain translated as a voice because that was the only framework it had for understanding sound that carried meaning. It was not speaking words, not English words anyway, but it was saying something. It was calling. It was saying his name, Daniel, in a voice that had the quality of wind through canyons, of water over stone, of time itself given acoustic form. He jerked his hand back from the well. For a moment he sat there, breathing hard, trying to rationalize what he had heard. It was the wind, he told himself. It was the sound of air moving through the passages of the cave system, resonating in particular ways because of the specific geology of this place, creating patterns that his brain was interpreting as language, because that was what brains did with uncertain sounds in darkness. But it was not the wind. The voice came again, and this time it was clearer. It said his name again, but with other words underneath it, other sounds, as if there were many voices speaking at once, all of them trying to say something, all of them using the same throat, the same resonance chamber, the same breathing well. And then he understood. The well was not just breathing, it was speaking. It was storing the voices of everyone who had ever come down into this place, everyone who had ever disappeared, everyone who had ever gone missing in the limestone country around Crow's End. And their voices were being held here, in the stone, in the mist, waiting to be spoken again, echoing upward toward the surface in the breathing rhythm of the earth. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone in Crow's End had heard stories about the Myers boy who disappeared in 1952, just walked out into the limestone hills one morning and was never seen again. About the surveyors in 1903 who had been mapping the ridge and had simply vanished, their equipment found at the edge of a sinkhole, but no trace of the men themselves. About the Cherokee who had lived in these hills before the Ashfords and everyone else. And where had they gone? How had they vanished so completely that almost no trace of them remained? They had come to this place, they had heard this breathing, and they had not been able to leave. Daniel stood up, his legs shaking, and he moved away from the well. He pointed his flashlight toward the passage through which he had come, and he began walking. He walked quickly, not running, because running was panic. And if he panicked, he would fall. And if he fell, he would not get up. But walking with a purpose, with a destination, with the understanding that he needed to leave this place. He needed to return to the surface. He needed to get away from the breathing and the voices and the living stone. But the passages had changed. The way he had come was not the way back. He could have sworn that he was retracing his steps, could have sworn that the passages were oriented the same way. But they were not. They twisted, they turned, they opened into chambers he did not remember, chambers that seemed to reconfigure themselves even as he was looking at them. Or perhaps they had always been that way, and he had simply not noticed. Perhaps the cave system was so vast, so complex, that no human mind could hold a map of it in their understanding. Perhaps every person who came down into these caves was lost the moment they entered, lost in a way that had nothing to do with navigation, and everything to do with the fact that the caves did not exist in the same way that the above-ground world existed. They existed in a different geometry, a different relationship to space and time. He found himself in a chamber filled with water. It was shallow, ankle-deep, cold enough to make him gasp. He moved through it, splashing despite his desire to move quietly. And on the other side, the passage opened into a larger space, and that larger space opened into another chamber. And in that chamber he saw them. They were stone. They had been stone for so long that he almost did not recognize them as ever having been anything else. But they were human shapes, or had been, sculpted by an unknown hand into forms that were caught between life and death, between solid and fluid, between the above world and the below. There were dozens of them, perhaps more. They were arranged in a spiral around the chamber, each one facing inward toward the center. each one with a mouth that was open, as if speaking, as if still trying to voice those words that the caves would not allow to escape. And in the center of the spiral, there was a shaft, not a well this time, but a shaft that descended straight down, perfectly vertical, perfectly circular, too perfect to be anything other than intentional. And from that shaft, there came a sound that was no longer a whisper, no longer a breath, but a roar, the roar of something vast, the roar of the mountain itself, of the earth itself, of time and geology, and the weight of millions of years of stone and pressure and darkness given a voice. Daniel did not remember running. He did not remember which passages he took, how he navigated the labyrinth of stone. But suddenly, he was at the entrance of the cave, squeezing back through the crevice he had widened, his clothes tearing, his skin scraping, the flashlight falling from his hand and breaking on the stone, the beam going dark. He climbed out of the sinkhole in darkness, using his hands and his feet, not knowing where the stone ended and the air began, not knowing if he was going up or down. But then his hand touched soil, warm, dry soil, and he pulled himself upward, and suddenly he was lying in the pasture, beneath the open sky, gasping for breath, with the sun still high, still in the same afternoon, as if no time had passed at all, as if the hours he had spent in the caves, exploring those passages, finding the well, hearing the voices, encountering those stone figures, had been compressed into a space so brief that the world above had barely registered his absence. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky, at the clouds moving across the blue, at the ordinary, comprehensible world of light and air and normal time. And then he heard it. From somewhere below, muffled by earth and stone, he heard it. The breathing, still calling, still speaking his name, still waiting for him to come back. Daniel Ashford did not go back to the caves, but the caves did not forget him. For the next 4 years he lived in that basement. He did not tell anyone what he had found, at least not in any way that they could understand. He told the doctors that he had fallen and hit his head. He told his family that he had gotten lost in the woods and simply wandered for days in a confused state. He told himself over and over that it had been a dream, a hallucination, a product of his mind in a confined space creating meaning from uncertainty. But he heard the breathing every night From underneath the house, from underneath the earth, a slow, patient, rhythmic sound that came up through the foundation, through the walls, through the very air itself. And he understood with a certainty that no amount of rationalization could diminish that the mountain was still calling, that the caves were still breathing, that somewhere in the dark places beneath his feet the well was still speaking, was still storing the voices of the lost, was still waiting. The breathing never stopped. In the quiet hours of the night, when everyone else was sleeping, Daniel would lie awake and listen, and he would hear it, not just the sound itself, but the meaning underneath it. The caves were telling him something. The stone was teaching him a language that had nothing to do with words, and everything to do with the deep time of the earth, with the slow geological processes by which mountains learn to think, to dream, to hunger. By 1978, when he was finally discovered in that basement, something had changed in Daniel Ashford. He had become part of the geology. His heartbeat had synchronized with the breathing of the caves. His thoughts moved at the speed of stone forming, of water carving, of time measured in epochs instead of years. He was still human in the most technical sense, but he was no longer entirely of the world above. The doctors could find nothing wrong with him. His physical health was good. His mental state was, by all measurable standards, stable. But he could not leave the basement. He could not go above ground. He said it was the sound. He said that above ground, the wind did not mask it. Above ground, the noise of the world made it harder to hear, and not hearing it, not listening to it, was worse than hearing it. When pressed, when asked directly what he was listening for, he would only whisper, "The mountain is learning to breathe. And when it finishes learning, when it has drawn enough breath, when it has remembered how to breathe the way it breathed before we were here, before there was anything human in these hills, then it will exhale, and everything above will go down." Daniel Ashford is still alive as of the writing of this report. He is no longer in that basement. He is in a facility in Lexington, in a room with thick walls where they play white noise constantly to mask other sounds. He does not speak. He does not eat unless he is fed. He does not respond to light or sound or touch in ways that other people understand. But at night, when the white noise is turned off, when there is silence, the orderlies report that he begins to rock back and forth with a rhythm that matches nothing in the recorded world except one thing: the recorded sound of geological time, the sound of stone compressing, of pressure building in the earth's crust, of the planet itself breathing. The farm in Crow's End still stands. The well remains dry. The pasture is quiet during the day, but at night some of the neighbors say you can hear something. A low sound rising from the earth. A sound like breath. A sound like the mountain waking up. A sound like time learning to speak. We do not know if there are others. We do not know how many people over the centuries have come across that sinkhole and felt drawn to the opening beyond. We do not know how many voices are trapped in the stone, waiting, speaking in that breath rhythm, calling out names that will never respond, calling out to the world above that cannot hear them. But we know that the earth is old. We know that stone has memory. We know that in the dark places beneath our feet there are systems of such complexity, such age, such indifference to human concerns, that it is presumptuous to assume we understand them at all. And we know from Daniel Ashford that some things are calling from below. Some things are breathing. Some things are patient enough to wait for millions of years, and interested enough in what we are to mock us with the sound of our own voices, echoing up from caves that will never release them. This is the end of Case File 061. The respiration continues. What you have heard is the account of Daniel Ashford, filed on October 14th, 1987. The limestone country around Crow's End remains largely unmapped, largely unvisited. The Ashford farm was sold in 1986 to parties unknown. The sinkhole, if it still exists, has not been documented in any geological survey since the event described in this file. But people still go missing in the limestone hills. People still report hearing sounds that they cannot explain. And in the basements of old houses built on karst terrain, sometimes, at night, the stone still breathes. We recommend that this file remain classified. We recommend that Daniel Ashford receive no visitors. And we recommend that no one attempt to locate or explore the cave system described in these accounts. The mountain is still learning to breathe, and it remembers the names of the lost.